The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.
Jim, I spent quite a bit of time looking into the background of Barack Obama, Barry Soetoro, and frankly, Barry Soetoro, I believe, remains his legal name. I could be wrong, but I have not found anything to suggest that he had legally changed it to Barack Hussein Obama. It could very well exist, but I have not seen it, not found it. What is, just to round out the discussion about Barack Hussein Obama, how in the world did this man get into office? And a lot of people will say, well, if he's the fraud that you and others say he is, if this is true and not some just conspiracy nonsense, they would have found out. People would have blown the whistle on the guy. So what's the story behind that? Is this a huge conspiracy, or is this just merely a smaller conspiracy relative to the larger conspiracy, I suppose? Is this kind of an easy thing to accomplish when you have key people on the inside working to elevate this man, or is this something different? That was a convoluted question. I apologize, but
no,
who in the world? Yeah, go ahead.
It's a very complex issue. It's a very complex person, and the program to put him in place has been very complex, with multiple layers of people. But when you talk about huge money, when you talk about huge amounts of power and influence, let's go back to the days when he was actually forwarded as the candidate for the Democratic Party. That's when big signals should have been sent to appropriate people. And when you look at that document that was signed by Pelosi and I can't remember the other name on it, but they signed on to the documentation that suggested that he was their candidate for president, the Democratic Party candidate for president of the United States. The norm up until that point, when they put him forward, the forms signed by the Republican Party and the Democratic Party said the same thing. What they basically said was that the person met and the criteria for eligibility to be the candidate and sit as the president of the United States. The Democratic Party changed that wording in order to accommodate Barack Hussein Obama. What it changed to was that he was the candidate of the party, nothing to do with eligibility, nothing to do with meeting criteria, nothing to do with law. So they skirted that whole issue, which meant that Pelosi, of course, wasn't guilty of uttering a forged document or committing fraud.
Gotcha.
That's a major thing.
Very major. And I want to know why that this issue, this topic of his eligibility 5 years after it was first broached, why it's still such a third-rail topic among journalists and among people. Why isn't Rush Limbaugh, why isn't Sean Hannity, why isn't Bill O'Reilly, all of the so-called conservative talk show host pundits, why aren't they screaming from the rooftops, hey, this guy is a fraud?
Well, you got one guy. You got one journalist out there who has a radio program named Eric Rush. And by the way, he's a racist. Eric Rush is a racist. Were you aware of that? He's a black guy calling a black guy a fraud.
Right.
Yeah. But of course, he can't be a racist because he's basically just telling the truth about a guy who happens to have the same skin color or tone as he does. But here you have, his program, by the way, is called Full Contact with Eric Rush. So there's my ad, by the way, for Eric Rush. He's a great guy. I consider him a good friend. And he's doing yeoman service. But he's one of the few voices out there, screaming at the top of his lungs. And he writes articles, of course, for WorldNet Daily and Canada Free Press. But also he appears on Hannity's show whenever there are issues of color or racism. Of course, Hannity, Sean calls on him. Because, the man is a smart dude and presents it well. And, he meets the criteria of someone people will listen to and realize this guy's telling the truth. And the truth is Obama's a fraud. You won't hear that being directly said by somebody like Rush Limbaugh. Sean can't say it because these guys are all sponsored by people selling products. And unfortunately, they don't have the intestinal fortitude to stand up for what's right. They're more interested in selling goods, housewares, whatever it is that they sell. You never want someone not to buy your product because they're ticked at you having the gall to get involved in this, tinfoil hat group who say that Obama is not eligible.
Right. No, I get that, and it seems like they are at a higher level of comfort. Of course, if you get paid a few $1 million a year or whatever they get paid, your lifestyle rises to that level, and of course, sometimes, sadly, the truth takes a backseat to the income. And
well, you want to be invited to the right parties too. I mean, you can't put me out now. You don't want to close off the faucet of information, and that would very quickly happen. Of course, what are you being fed, and who's feeding you? And those decisions are made by people like Rush and others. And I'm not saying that he's compromised, but it just makes sense to look at that as a factor that might impact and influence people as to how far they will go on issues. I have no sponsors. I'm a free man now. I even got my first pension check, so I'm pretty happy.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the.
Well, so you can't be bought. That's good. Before we move on, the people directly around Obama in his inner circle, like Valerie Jarrett, who, by the way, it's my understanding, will be getting a transcript of this broadcast. Valerie,
or he's either listening, or she's got a couple of people assigned to,
right.
record.
Well, it's going to be interesting when she gets this. But who are the people most influential? Who has Obama's ear, or who is doing the heavy work for Barack Obama?
Well, you've got two people. One is supposedly no longer involved, but keep in mind, like Van Jones, he's off. You fall into disgrace. Well, with those guys, you fall into disgrace. That's fine. They give you a new job. They increase your salary so you're happier than you were before, and then they call on you, and you get special privilege, and you get access, and you get all the other goodies, the speaking engagements. They take care of their own. These people are the best Chicago thugs you've ever seen. And boy, can they operate in that frame of reference. So the key people, though, David Axelrod has never departed the scene. He's back there manipulating things, having the advantage of being outside, looking in about what's going on, and making his advice known. And, of course, the conduit for that advice directly to the president, if he's not phoning directly in, is to Valerie Jarrett, who vets everything. There's nothing that goes on in America right now without Valerie Jarrett's stamp of approval, her imprimatur on it. Without her say-so, nothing happens. In fact, there are many people, the Secret Service, she's called Mrs. President.
Boy, that gives me the warm fuzzies. Yeah. Essentially for national.
What was that vote of yours worth? Do you remember putting that X next to Mrs. Jarrett?
Oh, yeah. It's kind of like a co-president, much like the Clinton administration. Interesting. So you've got David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett, of course, two people who we did not get Christmas cards from this year. Okay. Now, I'm going to move to another question here, because last October, just 2 months ago, a little over 2 months now, you had, it was October 10th, thereabouts. He had appeared on a radio show. I believe it was Now the End Begins program with Geoffrey Grider. You kind of dropped a interesting bombshell on that program where you had talked about the deaths of Andrew Breitbart, Michael Hastings, and Tom Clancy. I think that's when I really began to sit up and take notice about your level of knowledge with respect to what was really going on and what is going on in the realm of Obama's reach. You want to talk about that at all? Because I can see the silencing of people in the media. I can see it taking place. I can see it growing. I can see most of us now are being labeled as political dissidents. And, of course, I've earned my own CIA case file number, as well as many others in my venue, our venue. What can you tell us about the deaths of Breitbart, Hastings, Clancy, even, or others?
Well, let me say this. Pressures have been brought to bear on anyone who has any knowledge with authority. And of course, when I say knowledge with authority, it means that you've had access to materials, to people, to things that for some would be quite threatening. So, and for others quite embarrassing. And I want to say this gently and with reverence for the work of Andrew and Tom and for Mr. Hastings as well, Michael. Mrs. Breitbart had her best friend call me, and it was when I was saying that he had been murdered, and she was upset that I was saying it. And so I indicated to her friend, what the information was that I had and where I got it. And so I was quite truthful, quite honest, quite open, and I said, but if Mrs. Breitbart wants me to shut my mouth, it is shut, and I will never open it in public, in deference to the children who are more important than, my reputation or my ability to share things. And I was totally honest in it. I would have pulled right out. She phoned me back a day later and said, go for it. You have full permission to keep going.
Wow.
So
I gotta tell you
I want you to
something.
know that, as much as it may sound like we're being sensational, we're not being sensational for the sake of just, looking good or having interviews or something like that. There's a care and concern that I have that we're not doing damage to the important people in the lives of people who are now gone, and doing damage that way. Because how could I face Andrew Breitbart knowing I had brought some damage to his children? I couldn't do it.
And Jim, the information that Breitbart was threatening to release before his untimely death, do we know how much, if any, of that actual information he was talking about made it to the public?
None of it made it. It disappeared very, very quickly. And I want you to know this, that Hastings, Breitbart, and Clancy were working together. There was a cross-pollination of information. Tom's tasking in this whole thing.
Go ahead.
These three guys were working together on gathering information for a book that Tom was working on that would have exposed every detail of the life of Barack Obama in a novel form.
Interesting. So what was Breitbart's, if you can tell me without the compromise to whatever might be going on right now, is there anything about what Mr. Breitbart was going to disclose before he was, before he perished, that what never made it public? Can you tell us? Can you share with us?
Well, it had to do with the deaths of some people. That's the part of the information, and then the direct connection. He actually had paperwork on the direct connection with the money from the Arabs going into Barack Obama's pocket. There were some that went into his pocket, some that went, of course, to Columbia University to get him into Harvard, and of course, nobody got to see his records, even in the early days. So they were smart enough to protect him early. But that meant that people were being paid off, like the registrar at Columbia and the registrar at Occidental, and then Harvard, of course, you got a whole multi-layer of people who are to blame for things going on there. Because the guy never wrote, the reviews he was supposed to write as the law review editor. Things that normally took place for regular folks never took place for this guy, Obama. duties that other people would normally perform. He didn't perform them. He had other people covering for him. And, of course, money flowed. And where did that money come from? Breitbart knew exactly where it came from.
The only people who don't want to disclose the truth are people with something to hide.